This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
We don't want to waste our money controlling weeds if we don't have to, and often in the cases where you've got a beautiful native understory established, you're going to be doing more harm than good if you rush in there and chop all those trees down.
Today's episode of Rewilding in Action is supported by the Rod Donald Banks Peninsula Trust, whose vision is to create a thriving and enduring ecosystem of trails and regenerating landscapes on Te Pā Takaora Kaihautu Banks Peninsula. Projects supported by the Rod Donald Banks Peninsula Trust are based on 4 strategic pillars, namely access, partnerships, knowledge and biodiversity. For more information about their projects and news, go to roddonaldtrust.co.nz. Kia ora, I'm Maureen Howard and this is Rewilding in Action. Many exotic wilding plants are problematic in New Zealand. They can degrade native ecosystems and even replace them with exotic ecosystems. But there's some circumstances where the opposite can happen. And in today's episode is the first of 4 episodes focused on exotic plant species that under the right conditions can act as nursery plants for natives. Today I'm in the OAR FM studio on Zoom with my guest, Dr. Kate McAlpine, who's a weed ecologist based in Wellington and is a senior science advisor with the Department of Conservation. So welcome to the podcast, Kate.
Thank you, Maureen. Kia ora.
So before we get stuck in, Kate, I just wanted to make the point with our listeners that these weeds, exotic plants, they're not something that we would choose to have, are they?
Yeah, no, we would never be advocating to purposefully plant exotics as a nurse crop. Somebody else might, but it doesn't really fit with Department of Conservation objectives.
No, you might get in trouble for that. So before we go into the nitty-gritty of talking about particular plants, I was wondering if we could take a little step back and think about the general characteristics of weeds or these exotic plants that might make them suitable as a nursery plant for natives.
Sure, and we could certainly invent the ideal nurse crop weed. It would be relatively short-lived. It would be fast-growing. It would be able to establish quickly on bare ground. It would rapidly develop cover to shade out other weeds, particularly exotic grasses. It wouldn't be toxic or allelopathic, so it would not be hindering the establishment of natives in the understory, but that it would also die out in the medium to long term to be replaced by native species. And also you don't want something that spreads really easily or has a hugely long-lived seed bank.
Which is quite unusual. Well, I mean, in terms of exotics, I'm thinking of gorse and...
Yeah, well, gorse and broom certainly do, and those are the ones that we know a lot about. But lots of weeds don't have long-lived seed bank. Grey willow, for example, their seeds last about 12 weeks. So, yeah, it's not a universal trait. And actually, there's lots of species where we don't actually know how long lived the seed bank is because it's actually quite hard to study unless you've got a long period of time.
Right, yeah. And also, I guess the species it would need to attract in our birds, it would need to be able to attract in some way the native seed, wouldn't it?
That's definitely a bonus if it attracts birds, and not even necessarily as a food resource, but as a perch, for example, in an otherwise barren landscape. I often find that the taller trees or shrubs will have lots of seedlings underneath them because that's where the birds like to perch.
Yes. So gorse, it does tick some of these boxes. And in episode 15 of Rewilding in Action, I do actually do a full episode on gorse. It's called From Green to Gold. And so I encourage listeners to go back and listen to that one. It's very good. It's with Hendrik Kosch. But so I was just wondering if we could kind of focus in maybe on some of the other species. We've covered some of the general characteristics of these plants. It's still not better than having the natural regeneration through a native nursery crop, like, such as Kanika or Manica, is it?
Correct. There's some studies showing that native regeneration coming through an exotic species can be different from what it would look like if it come through a native species. Well, everything depends on your site and what the costs and benefits are and what you're hoping the outcome will be. In most cases, we don't have the luxury of it coming through natives. But actually, that reminds me, it's always interesting standing in a kānuka or mānuka forest where it's tall and relatively closed canopy. And if you have a look around the understory, it's incredibly diverse native species there, usually, assuming that you've got a seed source nearby. But one of the key aspects, and this applies to exotic native succession and exotic stands too, is that you don't see any mānuka or kānuka seedlings in that understory. And that's because it's an early colonising species and it needs quite a lot of light. And this is also exactly why exotic species can be useful. Actually, that might be a trait that I'd forgot to mention. One of the key ones is that it isn't shade tolerant as a seedling, because those are the species that can potentially keep regenerating under their own canopy and persisting at a site.
Yes.
But if it's a species that can't establish seedlings, then it will be, you've got the next generation developing in the understory. And if you're in a Mānuka Kānuka stand, it'll be other native species, broadleaf species, all shade tolerant. We have lots of shade tolerant native species in New Zealand, so we're lucky.
Yeah, and you might get, I guess, under a Kānuka canopy, you'll get perhaps a different mix of native species than you might underneath your exotic plants. And so I guess maybe some of those early successional species may be lost if we are going to an exotic system.
Yeah, and later successional species too might not necessarily come in. It's all hard to predict, of course, but often at a site that has regenerated naturally through an exotic species, it's worth, having a good look and seeing what species are missing that you think should be in the area. And then in most cases, it's probably because there's not a seed source nearby, but there might be some other conditions that have prevented that from happening. And that's where you can kind of supplement Mother Nature with a bit of planting.
Right. If you're doing the restoration approach, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if we can talk about some of the examples. I was very, very keen to have you on this episode to really get that big picture, of looking at exotic plants as a potential nursery and to move on from gorse. Shall we talk about broom? It's that plant that we have in the site that I work in at Dalmore Reserve, and we've been allowing it because it's much more pleasant to work in than with gorse.
Yeah.
And also it's a nitrogen fixer, and it seems to provide quite a lot of shelter for our other existing plants. But what kind of information can you tell us about broom?
About broom, yeah, very similar ecologically to gorse. So there's less information and evidence to show that natives can regenerate successfully to dominate a site through broom, but that definitely does happen. And just like gorse, it'll depend on the site. The drier a site is, the more difficult it is for natives to establish. But where there's sufficient rainfall and reasonably fertile soil and warm enough, then it acts like gorse.
And it's got a lifespan of around 15 years, I think.
Something like that. Yeah, I'm not sure on the exact number. But of course, if you count the seed bank, then in theory, the lifespan is a lot longer than that.
Yeah, but we're hoping that by then the natives will start getting above it and start shading it out. Like gorse, it's shade intolerant, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. And also like gorse, as long as you don't get a fire or a major disturbance, then you've got a pretty good chance if your natives are coming back by themselves and regenerating there, that could be a good site.
And I've heard of examples where we've had Scotch broom transitioning to elder, transitioning to natives, sort of like a sequential process. Have you come across that example?
I think that's a paper by Peter Williams, who did a lot of the early thinking on this topic. So yes, I am aware of it. But it's a really interesting example of how difficult it is to predict long-term outcomes at a site. Even if you can see exactly what's going on at the moment, something different could happen tomorrow. Yes,
this is it. And because being humans, we have a short lifespan, and so we're not often seeing the outcomes, the eventual outcomes of things. So maybe let's move on to pine trees, because that's something that's obviously we're doing huge amounts of at the moment. What kind of situations where could you see where natives could come up under pine?
Yeah, it's certainly another one where it depends entirely on the site, whether the pines are acting as a nurse crop for succession or completely transforming the whole ecosystem that won't go back without major interventions. So, but I've certainly seen sites, mostly abandoned plantations, so fairly good canopy cover, but standing in the understory, if you didn't look up, if you didn't know there was a pine canopy above you, you'd think you're in a native forest. And actually a really good example that's easy to access is at Zealandia in Wellington, where they've got a big presence of historical pine still, but the native understory is phenomenal. In the South Island, for example, where the natural vegetation is much shorter stature, grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, your native vegetation tends to be more like shrubs and low, short plants, so can easily be overtopped by weeds. And so this is not a blanket rule, but your native vegetation, if it's short, then those short plants, that is the canopy. And in most cases, they won't like another layer of canopy coming over top, even though it's, a shrubland or even a herbland. So, yeah, I don't think I explained that very well, but again, just totally depends on the site.
Well, really, for the exotic plant to die off, usually then it has to be topped, doesn't it?
Well, not necessarily, because actually what needs to happen is that you need to stop the next generation establishing. So this is where the shade tolerance of the seedlings comes into play. And it is a bit hard to get your head around, because that is what we always think, that for something to be shaded out, it has to be overtopped. Well, actually, it's the next generation that has to be shaded out. And this is where, that's what I mean by, if you see in the understory, there's no seedlings of that canopy species establishing, that may mean that they're not shade tolerant enough to establish. And as long as you don't have a major disturbance or a fire, then whatever else is coming in to the understory may be on track to be the next generation, whether they grow up and overtop the exotic species or not.
And what you said is really key. It's actually looking at what's there, isn't it? Having a look underneath the exotic plants and seeing what's actually growing up.
That's right. And gorse and broom are the nurse crop species that we know most about, but I did a piece of work a few years ago looking at as many sites as I could where other exotic species were the dominant canopy species around the country, and just having a look on the understory and see what was happening there, to see A, if natives could potentially regenerate under those canopies, and B, if the canopy species was establishing as seedlings under its own canopy, to get a bit of a better picture on, how many species could this be a potential situation for? Because, of course, we don't want to waste our money controlling weeds if we don't have to. And often in the cases where you've got a beautiful native understory established, you're going to be doing more harm than good if you rush in there and chop all those trees down. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think there were about 50 exotic plant species where they dominated the canopy but had no seedlings growing in the understory. So way more potential than we currently think. However, it depends on the site, and I can't stress that enough. Even with gorse, where we think, it's this magic nurse crop, it's not always. And for some of these species, particularly sycamore and tree privet, it was really quite intriguing, because for both of those species, I found sites where the weed was regenerating like crazy in its understory, like there was almost nothing else under the sycamore canopy except sycamore seedlings, ditto with tree privet. And yet at other sites, there were zero tree privet or sycamore seedlings in the understory. It was totally native. And there was no obvious difference between these sites, no obvious difference. So it would be amazing to understand that better, to see if there's any factors that we can manipulate to steer it towards one rather than the other. So, yeah, there's definitely potential for those two species to act as a nurse crop. However, they're both, the sycamore's a tall tree and it produces masses of seeds that are wind dispersed. So spread from the source is a huge issue for that one. And of course, tree privet is dispersed by birds. So that is always a consideration.
And it's really interesting what you're saying, because a sycamore, it's one of those species that I have thought we had to have zero tolerance for, because we are afraid of it spreading through and replacing our native forest, aren't we?
Look, I'd be very nervous about sycamore, and if at all possible, I would not advocate for leaving that one to be a nurse crop, unless that's what you're already seeing, because it really is Russian roulette with that one, because it is a massive problem. So I wouldn't have a blanket rule for any exotic species, but particularly species that we know are hugely problematic. Tree lucerne is probably the one exotic species that is discussed as a really potentially good nurse crop. I don't know if you've had much experience with that one.
I've got much of it in my garden, and it has brought lots of birds in that have then delivered seed, native seed.
Yeah, well, that's the good thing. Birds love them, the flowers and the leaves. They don't disperse the seeds, which it's a legume, of course, so they're big, heavy pods that drop to the ground. Seeds are fairly long-lived, and they can disperse in water, I think. So seed spread is less of an issue, say, than with tree privet or sycamore. But it brings the birds and therefore brings the seeds, as you've seen for yourself. It's a nitrogen fixer, and it's not particularly long-lived and not particularly shade tolerant as a seedling. So if you were ever going to advocate that an exotic crop might be planted to improve native regeneration at a highly disturbed, modified site, that could be one. But again, you wouldn't want to do it on the top of a hill, because those seeds are going to disperse by gravity, not if it's by a river. So yeah, there's always those considerations to take into effect.
That's really interesting to hear. Now, one of my episodes that I'm going to be doing soon on Banks Peninsula, the topic of the episode will be about Macrocarpa frilling. And this is where the tree is killed, but it's left standing. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about this, because this could apply to a number of different species of trees, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And I may even know the site that you're talking about. I visited it during that process of going around the country looking at sites that had been controlled and to see what was happening next. And certainly that was a dense native understory. Yeah, so frilling, or any method of killing the tree but leaving it standing, is usually better for native regeneration, because the opening of the canopy is much more gradual and patchy, and therefore it's more of a natural process rather than what happens if you cut trees down, because that's a massive instant influx of light, and that tends to favour weeds that come in and establish really rapidly. But the dead tree standing will cast shade for decades, depending on the species. And yeah, it's just that nice gradual opening up of light, enough that natives can establish, but the very light demanding other weed species can't. Yeah, and there's also a lot less disturbing to any understory that is already in place at the time that the control happens. Because again, if you chop the trees down, they're going to smash the understory. Although having said that, I'm constantly gobsmacked at how native plants can recover from being absolutely thrashed. Mahoe and pigeonwood, particularly good at that.
I'm just really interested in exotic ground cover as well. And in a way, I'm thinking grass is much better than so many other things that are shade tolerant. I don't know if you look at ground cover weeds too, do you?
I have looked at ground cover weeds, particularly Tradescantia, climbing asparagus, and Plectranthus. Plectranthus is a little bit like Tradescantia, to see what sort of effect those ground cover weeds have on native regeneration. And in general, the answer is it's really bad for native regeneration. And exotic grasses are too. So again, it would depend on site as to what, I would suggest there.
Thinking about grass, most people, they'll have a paddock and they can either go one way or the other. They can let it regenerate naturally, which could end up being through gorse or through broom, or they could plant into it. And, we're sort of left with these two options. So one of them is a lot more labour intensive and costly. But what happens with the gorse? It is actually perhaps more uniformly killing the grass, would you say?
Yes. More uniform than
just planting into it, because then you have years of, cutting the grass around the tree, and quite often there never seems to be the same infill.
Yeah. No, I think I'd have to agree with that exotic grasses are probably the number one impediment to restoration sites, particularly when you're planting into a bare paddock. So, again, it depends how much resources you've got, how much people power, and maybe a combination approach might be worth a try. A little bit of planting, maybe in islands to attract the birds in, allowing gorse to establish in places, perhaps trying to get a bit of manuka or kānuka in there, because in theory that's an early colonizer, although that will struggle with exotic grass as well. So, yeah, it's a huge problem.
It is. So I know there are a lot of challenges, aren't there? When it comes to doing this.
Yes.
But one of the challenges I've been thinking of is the kind of the blanket intolerance that people have to exotics, to the word weed. Once something's got the label of weed. And I was just wondering what your experience has been and perhaps how you've counteracted that.
Oh, that's a political question, Maureen.
Oops.
Oh, gosh, it's a tricky topic, and people get very caught up in the language. But I guess coming from my perspective, which is a conservation perspective, it's only natural to see. I wouldn't call all exotic species weeds by any means, but once something's proved itself to be a weed, I'm afraid I'm going to think of it as a weed.
Right. And by that you mean that it's invasive and it's spreading and
that it's having negative impacts on our native biodiversity or ecosystems. Yeah. But as I've constantly been saying, it depends a lot on site. So it's often a grey area.
Yeah. And I guess plants like gorse and broom, they have been the bane of the farmer. If you're wanting land to be a paddock, then in that sense, they are a weed. And for me, like if I'm doing an episode on gorse, for example, just getting over that hurdle with people that this is, in some circumstances, can actually be a nursery crop to allow our natives to come through. So, yeah. Have you found any change in terms of how you think about some of these plants, from when you started in the early days?
Definitely. And going around the country looking in the understory of all these woody weed stands was totally changed my perspective. That, you look at a site like that from the outside and you see it completely dominated by an exotic species, and you think, well, that's going to be completely exotic. And the understory as well. And then having a look and you find it's a native forest under there that, it definitely changed my mind that, as with anything in ecology, it just is so variable and so site-specific that it's good to keep an open mind.
Thanks very much to my guest, Dr. Kate McAlpine, for sharing her scientific knowledge about natural native forest regeneration through woody weeds. I hope you found this as important a conversation as I have. I'm loving this learning journey about how rewilding can work in Aotearoa. One piece of information that I hadn't thought of is that when natives are growing through exotic woody weeds, the critical factor is not that the natives can outshade the exotic nursery plant to kill it, but rather that the woody weed is not reseeding under itself. After travelling around the country to look for examples, Kate and her colleagues published a paper in 2018 in the New Zealand Journal of Ecology in which they surveyed species composition and percentage cover in the understory of 132 closed canopy stands of 41 woody weed species throughout New Zealand. Of the 41 woody weed species, 27 had 0 or very few woody weed seedlings or saplings coming up underneath. Examples of some of these woody weed species that were being nursery plants for natives included Douglas fir, European larch and grey or pussy willow. And importantly, most of the stands that Kate and her colleagues looked at had a good number of natives coming up underneath, and as you'd expect, those with native forest nearby did better in terms of native regeneration. And the key point that Kate made repeatedly in our chat is that we need to look at regeneration through exotics on a case-by-case basis. And the best way to do this is to see what's coming up underneath. Thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to like it and to share it. In my next episode, I'll be on Banks Peninsula to talk with my guest, Bob Webster, about macrocarpa frilling. Until next time, I will leave you with some bird song from naturally regenerating native forest that's loved by my guest, Dr. Kate McAlpine, a rewilder who is letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.